Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we get started with today's episode, I just want to let you know that this is going to be the second to last episode of the podcast for this year. So there is today's episode, and then there'll be one more coming out next Tuesday. And then I'm going to be taking a break for the last 2 weeks of December, just with holiday things and to have a little bit of rest and relaxation. So we will be back in January. First episode will be dropping the first Tuesday in January, which I believe is January 6th. So we're going to take a little 2-week break, and then we will be back with loads of new episodes for the new year. Just while we're talking about the podcast, this is your reminder to like and subscribe and share and leave a comment, leave a review. Any sort of engagement you are able to do with the podcast really helps just to get the word out and help other people to find the podcast, and I'm so grateful for all of that. Speaking of gratitude, people have been starting to get their Spotify Wrapped for the year. I know this is like a big thing for everybody who uses Spotify, and among that, it will tell you what your top podcasts are. And people have been tagging me when the Dance Physio podcast is showing up in their top 5 podcast listens, or whatever you want to call it, for the year. And it just fills me with so much joy and so much gratitude to know that people are listening to the podcast so consistently that it is showing up in their Spotify Wrapped. So much thanks to all of you guys out there listening. And without further ado, I am going to dive into today's podcast topic. So, like a lot of episodes, this one is inspired by questions that I get a lot in the clinic. And this question is almost always from concerned parents, although sometimes dancers themselves are asking it. But a lot of times it's from concerned parents, and they'll come in and say things like, my dancer's joints pop all the time. They're always cracking, clicking, popping, they're making all of these noises. Is this something we should be concerned about? And sometimes dancers themselves are asking this question because they'll sort of say, I'm hearing these noises. Is this normal? So today I want to get into a little bit about that joint popping, or sometimes we call it cracking, that we are pretty accustomed to hearing in our joints as dancers. We're going to talk a little bit about what it is and whether we should or should not be concerned about it. So, first of all, it is important to know that there are lots of different reasons why our bodies will make noise. And so this is kind of like when you take your car into the mechanic and you're like, oh, it's making a funny noise. And the mechanic will be like, well, is it more of like a thunking noise or a thumping noise or a whirring? They'll kind of try and figure out what that noise is. This is much the same. If dancers are coming into the clinic and saying to me, my joints are making noise, or I'm getting this clicking or this popping or what have you, my first question is what type of a noise is it? Because our bodies can make noises for all sorts of different reasons, and some of them we may need to be concerned about, and some of them we definitely don't need to be concerned about. And so when we are hearing noises or kind of experiencing noises or sensations that are more of like a clicking or kind of a grinding, or what are other good examples? Clicking is probably like the one that most people will, or snapping. That's like the other description that people will kind of talk about. Those noises very often are coming from tendons or other soft tissues, but it's usually tendons that are sort of rubbing back and forth in an area. And those noises are usually really reproducible. So it's like every time you go to, do a circle with your ankle, for instance, a tendon flicks back and forth and it makes a little snapping noise or clicking noise or whatever it is. And those types of noises, we probably do want to get investigated. Like I said, there can be different reasons for it, but often it is a tendon issue. And although it maybe starts as being pain-free and it's just like a noise that you're noticing. If that tendon is continuing to kind of snap back and forth, it can get irritated and turn into a bigger issue. This is similar to, we've talked about it before on a podcast episode, episode 51 on snapping hip syndrome. That would be another example of that type of noise. And so those types of snapping or, kind of clicking and stuff like that, that is not what I'm going to call joint noises. That's not what we're going to like dive into today. But if that is what is happening, you probably do want to get that assessed and figure out why that's happening and address like the underlying root cause. The noises that I want to like dive into a little bit more today are what I would just call joint cracking or joint popping. And so the easiest way to think about this is like, I think everyone's familiar with that sensation of your knuckles cracking. So you go to like move your hand or do something, or some people will like kind of make it happen. That is the type of joint noise that we're talking about today. And generally, these joint noises are very, very, very normal and nothing to be worried about, as long as when they are happening, it is pain-free. So in a dance class, the best example of this is, at the bar, it's the first exercise of the day. Everybody's like lined up, your feet are in first position, and you go into your first grand plie, and you will hear kind of snap, crackle, pop, like all the way up the bar. And some people's ankles might be cracking, some people's hips, some people's knees, whatever it is. And it's usually just that first or maybe first and second plie that you hear it, and then you're not like noticing it anymore throughout the rest of the class. Those are the types of joint noises we're talking about. They usually don't cause any pain or discomfort and are like fairly harmless. So we don't need to be concerned about them. There used to be, I'm going to say there probably still is, a lot of concern that that type of joint cracking or popping causes sort of quote unquote wear and tear on the joint. And so there is a lot of misinformation that that type of joint cracking is going to cause arthritis or cause your joints to wear out prematurely. And I think that's why parents are sometimes concerned about how much their dancers' joints crack. And so they'll come in and kind of ask these questions. But there is no research that supports that type of joint cracking causes any sort of wear and tear. And this has been like refuted a lot, but it continues to be one of those kind of myths that's perpetuated just in the general population. People will be like, oh, don't want to have like cracking joints because they're going to wear out. With that being said, I am talking about just like normal, you're, a human being moving through life and you go to like bend down or crouch down to get something. And yeah, you feel like a little bit of like a crack or a pop in your knee or, like your knuckles or things like that. We do not want to be forcing our joints to crack. And this is where dancers maybe sometimes can have a little bit of an issue, because we have joints that make noises when we move through regular movements. And then we can kind of force our joints to create those noises sometimes. And so this would be that example of somebody who's like constantly making their knuckles crack, like, tens, if not hundreds of times a day. You'll see people who compulsively do that. And that can create issues sort of in the long term if we're doing it repeatedly through forceful movements. And it's not so much the actual cracking itself, because I'm going to talk a little bit about like what is that is happening in a second. It's not so much that, but when we're forcing our joints into those positions to create that cracking sound, we are usually putting our joints in a position that's causing stress through the stabilizing structures of the joint. So if you think about like how you would go about cracking your knuckles, you're like forcing them into a certain position that's putting stress through the stabilizing features, mostly the ligaments, but there's other stabilizing features as well. And if we're doing that over and over and over and over and over again, repeatedly through time, that can cause instability in the joint, and that can cause problems. And eventually that could cause, some, I hate the term wear and tear, but it could cause some issues in the joint later on down the road from the instability. So it is not the joints cracking themselves that is problematic. It is us forcing them to crack repeatedly over time, if that makes sense.
And this is something we see a lot in dancers where they will get in the habit of constantly wanting to, crack their low back or their hips or whatever it is. And again, when I'm talking to dancers about this, we're saying it's not problematic if your hips, crack when you go into a grand plie, at the beginning of class or any time really. But when it's just like happening as kind of a bit of a one-off, or maybe it's happening once or twice in a day when you're doing a normal movement, that is not problematic at all, assuming it is pain-free. It is if we are forcing our bodies into those positions and doing it repeatedly throughout the day. People can become a little bit addicted to the sensation. Like there's this like kind of relieving type sensation that happens when our joints crack, and people can become like slightly addicted to that sensation. And so it becomes like a habit more than anything that they like need to or feel this compulsion to crack their joints all the time. It can be a very hard habit to break, but that we don't want to encourage dancers to be doing when they're doing it repeatedly over time. But if we're just talking about joints that make noise when we're doing normal movements throughout our day, that in itself is not problematic. So what is that noise? Like what is actually happening? We get this question all the time. And the actual noise that is happening, like I keep using, the term popping and cracking or whatever, but the actual technical term for it is cavitation. So we call them joint cavitations, and that is where the little noise comes from. We can actually have cavitations that happen in joints that don't make a sound. So there's not always a sound associated with it, but more often than not, there is a sound. And it used to be that we thought that sound came from like a gas bubble within the joint, kind of like escaping. I don't know if that's the right word. And that used to be what they thought was the cause of the noise or the cause of this cavitation. But we actually now know that cavitation is due to the formation of the gas bubble, not the gas bubble like escaping from the joint. So it's the formation of a gas bubble. It's called tribonucleation. And don't ask me at all the physics of how it works. I cannot tell you like the exact kind of physiology or physics of how that happens. But it is that formation of the gas bubble that causes that cavitation. And usually it's only going to happen one time within sort of like a short period of time and can't be reproduced immediately again. So, and it can vary what that length of time is, but usually it's like maybe 20 to 30 minutes, which is why, again, if we think about our dancers in class and we hear all those snap, crackle, pops as they do their first pliés or whatever of a class, they then generally, you're not going to continue to hear that through every exercise or even through the second side of the bar necessarily, because those cavitations that happen are not going to be reproduced immediately when it is this phenomenon that is happening within the joints. Again, if we have noises that are happening, and again, it's going to be usually more like thunking or clunking or snapping or clicking that's happening every single time you do a movement. And so a good example of this is somebody who like kicks or lifts their leg up, and every time their leg comes down, they feel this like thunk kind of feeling. That is a different issue, and that is definitely something we want to get assessed. The other types of joint noises, we don't need to be concerned about. One of the other questions that I commonly get from, again, parents more often is like, why do dancers seem to make so much more noise in their body than maybe the general population? And this is probably where some of the parents' concern comes from as well, because they come in and say, I'm not a dancer and my body doesn't make noises like that. Like, yes, maybe things like, crack or pop every once in a while, but it's not like every time I'm walking down the stairs or, whatever. Why is my dancer making so much more noise? And there's probably two main reasons for this that are kind of linked to each other, but we see a higher prevalence of these types of joint noises in people who are more hypermobile. And we tend to have more people who are hypermobile in the dance industry. So dance kind of pre-selects a lot for people that have a lot of mobility available to them because there's so many mobility and flexibility requirements in dance. So we probably see a higher prevalence of hypermobility in dance populations than we do in the general population. So that is part of it, probably. And then the other reason, and again, these are totally, totally linked, but in dance, we are moving our joints through larger ranges of motion. So whether we're hypermobile or not, we're moving through large ranges of motion because we're doing things at the end ranges of motions of where joints can kind of like get to, or the positions they can achieve. And that just creates more opportunities for the joints to make noise. And so that is probably also just why hypermobile people in general, so not dancers necessarily, but just hypermobile everyday people, also experience more joint noises than the average population because their joints are just moving through a bigger range of motion throughout their day-to-day life. Therefore, more opportunities for them to make noise. So it's not usually dance itself that is the problem in terms of, is this a risky activity? Is this dangerous? Should I be concerned? But it is providing the opportunity for those joints to move through larger ranges of motion, and especially if those larger ranges of motion are maybe potentially uncontrolled, that may be providing more opportunities for these joint noises. So just one more reason why we want to make sure that we are always moving through our range of motion in a controlled, active way, as opposed to just kind of flailing ourselves and exploiting the mobility that may be available, especially if we are hypermobile. So that is just gives you a little kind of summary of what these joint noises are. Like I said, the vast majority of time, we do not need to be concerned at all about these little clicks and pops and cracks and stuff that our joints are making. But there are a few times where we do potentially want to be concerned and want to go and have that evaluated. So that would be any of those joint noises that are associated with pain. So if every time you lower your leg down, you're getting a clunking and it's painful when it happens, definitely go get that assessed. We talked about, if it's reproducible, if it's happening every single time you're doing a movement, that is different than these cavitations that generally only happen once and then won't happen again for a period of time. If there's like a really obvious feeling of instability, so somebody's like, it feels like it needs to crack, or it feels like it does crack, and then it feels really unstable, it feels loose, it feels like my joint's gonna like pop out, like some people will describe those sensations, that is definitely something we want to be concerned about as well, and seek out medical attention probably, and have an assessment. And when I say seek out medical attention, I'm not saying like go to the emergency department or anything like that. It's just whoever your medical team is, whether it's a physical therapist or a chiropractor or somebody who knows your body, we want to have that assessed and figure out what it is that's causing it. Is it a bit of a functional instability? Is there, some sort of an issue with the tendons, whether that's like, the tendon length, or is there inflammation in the tendon? Like, what is happening? So it's not an emergency, but definitely go get evaluated by a medical professional. So joint noises that are associated with pain, significant or reproducible sounds that are happening every time we're moving, feelings of instability. And then the last one that we want to be like concerned about is if we're having any of these kind of like joint popping noises and stuff that are followed by any sort of like numbness or tingling or sometimes like swelling in the area, that could be an indication that potentially there's like some subluxation happening in the joint, and that we want to be concerned about as well. And again, that's going to be more common in our hypermobile population. In the general population, that's not going to be something that we see super often, but we just want to have it on our radar to make sure that if that type of thing is happening, that we are getting evaluated by a medical professional. So hopefully that answers some of your questions about why do my joints make so many noises? Why are they popping and clicking and cracking and making all those snap, crackle, pop sounds? Hopefully that has cleared things up a little bit for people. People have a better understanding of what is actually happening and why we don't usually need to be concerned about it the vast majority of the time. If you have any questions, want further clarification or anything like that, please feel free, reach out, send me a message. You can reach me on social media at Dance Physio Erika, Erika with a K, or send me an email. My email is in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.